Billionaire's mother disguised herself as a beggar to test her son's fiancée. What happened shocked everyone. "Leave my sight, you dirty thing." Vanessa's voice cut across the mall parking lot, sharp enough that several shoppers turned to look. The old woman standing at her car window flinched back, her torn clothes and bare feet caked with dust, her outstretched hands still trembling from hunger. "Please, madam," she tried again, quieter now. "I haven't eaten since yesterday. Anything you can spare." "Did you not hear me?" Vanessa didn't even lower her sunglasses. "You're going to scratch my paint standing there." "Security!" She waved sharply toward the mall entrance. "Get this woman away from here. She's disturbing the customers." The old woman stumbled back as a guard approached, her eyes lingering for one long moment on Vanessa's face, memorizing it, though Vanessa would never have guessed why, or that the beggar she'd just humiliated in a parking lot was about to determine the entire course of her future. 20 minutes later, on a quiet street 2 blocks away, a different woman knelt beside the same old beggar, who was now sitting exhausted against a wall. "Mama, are you all right?" Grace asked gently, crouching down to her level without a trace of hesitation or disgust. "Come, let me get you something to eat, and you can rest at my place tonight if you need to." The old woman looked up at her with something unreadable in her tired eyes. "You don't even know me." "I don't need to know you to see that you need help," Grace said simply, helping her to her feet. What Grace didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, walking a stranger home to share her own modest dinner, was that the woman she'd just shown kindness to controlled one of the largest business empires in Lagos, and was, at that very moment, deciding exactly which of 2 women deserved to become her son's wife. The billionaire's mother had found her answer. She just hadn't decided yet how far she was willing to go to prove it to everyone else. If you've ever wondered whether kindness quietly gets noticed even when nobody's watching, hit subscribe, because tonight we find out exactly what happens when it does. 3 months before that parking lot encounter, Margaret Whitfield had already begun quietly worrying about her son's engagement, though she'd said almost nothing about it to anyone, including James himself. Margaret was 71 years old, the founder and majority shareholder of Whitfield Industries, a conglomerate spanning real estate, manufacturing, and logistics, that she'd built from a single textile factory nearly 50 years earlier, back when very few people believed a young widow with 2 small children could run anything larger than a household. She'd buried a husband, raised James alone through his most difficult years, and built an empire specifically so that her son would never have to know the particular desperation she'd once known herself. She'd also learned across 5 decades of business and life to trust almost nothing at face value. "You've known her 4 months, James," Margaret said carefully, the evening he first brought Vanessa home for a formal family dinner. "That's not very long to be discussing marriage." "When you know, Mum," James said, watching Vanessa across the table with the particular besotted attentiveness of a man genuinely convinced he'd found something rare. "She doesn't care about any of this." He gestured vaguely at the dining room's obvious wealth. "She likes me for who I am." Margaret studied Vanessa throughout that entire dinner with the careful, unhurried attention she'd once used to evaluate business partners who claimed the exact same thing about their own intentions. Vanessa was polished, charming, complimentary in exactly the right measured doses. Never so eager it seemed desperate, never so reserved it seemed disinterested. She asked thoughtful questions about James's work, laughed at his jokes with what appeared to be genuine warmth, and left, at the end of the evening, having said absolutely nothing that Margaret could point to as evidence of anything beyond a woman successfully, skillfully performing exactly what a prospective mother-in-law would want to see. It unsettled Margaret more than open rudeness would have. "What did you think of her?" James asked the following morning, clearly hoping for his mother's enthusiastic approval. "I think," Margaret said carefully, "that I've met a great many people in 50 years of business who were extremely good at seeming like exactly what a room needed them to seem like. I'm not saying Vanessa is one of them. I'm saying one dinner isn't enough for me to know the difference." "You don't trust her." "I don't know her," Margaret corrected gently. There's a difference, James. Give me time. I'm not trying to stand in the way of your happiness. I'm trying to make sure it's real before you build a marriage on top of it. James, in the particular impatience of a man freshly, deeply in love, found his mother's caution frustrating rather than reasonable. She's not after the company, Mum, if that's what you're worried about. She barely lets me pay for dinner. Barely, Margaret repeated softly, filing the word away with the same careful attention she gave every detail in a negotiation. Isn't the same as never. The idea, when it finally arrived, came to Margaret nearly a month later, during a quiet evening spent reviewing old photographs from her own difficult early years. The small flat she'd shared with James as a child. The months she'd genuinely gone hungry rebuilding the business after her husband's death. The particular specific desperation of needing help from strangers and discovering exactly how differently people treated a woman in expensive clothes versus a woman in rags. People show you exactly who they are, she remembered thinking, decades earlier, watching wealthy acquaintances cross the street rather than acknowledge her during her hardest years, when they think being kind to you costs them absolutely nothing to refuse. She'd never told James the full extent of those years. She'd built Whitfield Industries specifically, so he'd never need to understand that particular kind of desperation firsthand. But watching him prepare to marry a woman whose character remained, after 5 months, still fundamentally unverified, Margaret found herself returning to the oldest, simplest test she knew. Watch what someone does for a person who can offer them nothing in return. It took her 2 weeks to arrange it properly. Worn clothing sourced quietly through a personal assistant sworn to absolute discretion, a cover story about an extended private retreat that discouraged questions from the household staff, and a careful, deliberate erasure of every trace of the polished, immaculately presented Margaret Whitfield that Lagos society would have recognized instantly. "Are you certain about this, Ma?" her assistant Comfort asked, helping her into the worn, dust-colored clothing for the first time, genuine concern in her voice. "It's not safe for a woman your age to be out on the streets alone, disguise or no disguise." "I'll only be out during daylight hours, and only near places I know well," Margaret said. "I need to see this for myself, Comfort. Not through reports, not through what people choose to tell me when they know I'm listening. I need to see what Vanessa does when she thinks nobody important is watching." She had no idea, tying the worn headscarf over her carefully grayed hair that first morning, exactly how quickly or how cruelly she'd get her answer. The parking lot encounter wasn't Margaret's first attempt. She'd spent nearly a week, quietly, deliberately positioning herself at locations where she knew Vanessa's schedule would eventually intersect with hers. Outside the gym Vanessa frequented, near the salon she visited weekly, once even outside the office building where Vanessa worked as a marketing executive. Each time, Margaret approached carefully, asking for nothing more than spare change or a moment's kindness, watching closely for whatever Vanessa's unguarded reaction might reveal. The first 2 encounters, Vanessa had simply ignored her entirely, walking past without acknowledgement. Not cruel exactly, but the specific, practiced invisibility Margaret remembered wealthy people extending to beggars during her own difficult years, treating poverty itself as something to be stepped around, rather than a person to be seen. It was the third encounter, at the mall parking lot, that finally revealed something considerably worse than simple indifference. "Leave my sight, you dirty thing." Margaret flinched back from the sharpness in Vanessa's voice, genuinely startled, despite having anticipated some version of rejection. She'd expected at worst another wave of dismissive indifference. She hadn't expected open cruelty, delivered loudly enough that several other shoppers turned to watch. "Please, madam," she tried, keeping her voice appropriately humble and trembling, though something colder and more clinical was already forming behind her carefully lowered eyes. "I haven't eaten since yesterday. Anything you can spare." "Did you not hear me?" Vanessa snapped, not even lowering her sunglasses to look properly at the woman she was addressing. "You're going to scratch my paint standing there. Security!" She waved sharply toward the mall entrance, her voice carrying the particular irritation of someone genuinely inconvenienced rather than moved. "Get this woman away from here. She's disturbing the customers. A guard approached quickly, taking Margaret gently but firmly by the arm, and Margaret allowed herself to be led away, glancing back once at Vanessa, who had already turned back to her phone, the entire interaction apparently forgotten before Margaret was even fully out of earshot. "She barely lets me pay for dinner," James had said weeks earlier, entirely earnest in his conviction that Vanessa's warmth toward him reflected her true character. Margaret understood now, with the particular clarity of 5 decades spent reading people's true selves beneath their careful presentations, exactly how selectively Vanessa's warmth had been extended. She was still sitting against a wall 2 blocks away, genuinely shaken despite the disguise being entirely her own choice, when a different voice reached her. Gentler, immediate, entirely unprompted by any performance Margaret had offered. "Mama, are you all right?" Margaret looked up to find a young woman crouched beside her, dressed simply but neatly, her expression carrying none of the practiced caution people usually extended to strangers on the street. "I'm fine, my dear," Margaret said, though her voice, for the first time all week, carried a slight genuine tremor she hadn't entirely planned. "Just resting." "You don't look fine," the young woman said, studying her with quiet concern. "Come, let me get you something to eat. And you can rest at my place tonight if you need to. It's not far." "You don't even know me," Margaret said, testing, the same way she tested Vanessa, though something in her voice had already begun softening in a way she hadn't intended. "I don't need to know you to see that you need help," the young woman said simply, offering her hand to help Margaret up. "I'm Grace, by the way." Grace's flat when they arrived was modest. A single room in a working-class area of Lagos, sparse but clean, evidence of careful, disciplined living on what was clearly a limited income. She prepared a simple meal without hesitation or complaint, insisted Margaret take the only real bed while she slept on a mat, and spent the evening in quiet, unhurried conversation that never once probed for details Margaret wasn't offering. "You work hard for what little you have," Margaret observed, watching Grace carefully mend a tear in her own work uniform by lamplight, the same modest attentiveness Margaret had once shown her own worn clothing decades earlier. "Everyone works hard for what they have," Grace said simply. "Some people just have more to show for it than others. That doesn't make the hard work different. Some people wouldn't have stopped to help a stranger, working this hard themselves." Grace looked up, something genuinely puzzled in her expression, as though the observation hadn't previously occurred to her as remarkable. "Why wouldn't I? You needed help. I had a little to give. That's not complicated, Mama." Margaret studied her for a long moment in the lamplight, the same modest, unglamorous kindness she'd been searching for, offered without hesitation, without calculation, without any awareness that the woman she was helping controlled a fortune large enough to change her entire life with a single decision. She had her answer. She'd known it, in truth, from the moment Grace first knelt beside her on that street. What she hadn't yet decided was exactly how to use it. The following morning, Margaret returned to her own estate, bathed, dressed once again in the polished, immaculate presentation Lagos society recognized, the disguise carefully packed away, and found James waiting anxiously in the entrance hall, having been told only that his mother had been unreachable for several days on a private matter. "Mum, where have you been?" "I was starting to worry." "I've been testing something," Margaret said carefully, studying her son's genuinely relieved expression, weighing exactly how much of the truth he was ready to hear. "James, I need to tell you something about Vanessa, and about someone else entirely, who I think you should meet." James listened to his mother's account with an expression that shifted over the course of 10 minutes from confusion to disbelief to something considerably more painful. "You disguised yourself as a beggar," he repeated slowly, "to test Vanessa, without telling me, without asking me. Would you have let me if I'd asked?" "No," James admitted. "Because it feels like exactly the kind of manipulation you'd have objected to if someone did it to you." "I did it," Margaret said quietly, "because I've watched too many people in my life perform kindness beautifully for an audience and abandon it completely the moment they believe no one important is watching. I needed to know which version of Vanessa was real, The one who charms this family at dinner, or the one who screamed at an old woman for standing too close to her car? James sat down slowly, absorbing this. What exactly did she do? Margaret told him carefully, precisely, resisting the urge to soften any of it for his benefit. She described the sharpness in Vanessa's voice, the immediate call for security, the complete indifference with which Vanessa had turned back to her phone before Margaret was even fully out of earshot. Maybe she was having a bad day, James said, though the defense sounded weak even to his own ears. Maybe she didn't realize how harsh she sounded. James. Margaret's voice carried the particular gentleness she reserved for moments she knew would hurt, regardless of how carefully she delivered them. I've spent 50 years learning to tell the difference between someone having a bad day and someone revealing their actual character. This wasn't a bad day. This was Vanessa, entirely unguarded, believing there would be no consequences for how she treated someone she considered beneath her notice. And the other woman? James asked finally, though something in his voice suggested he already suspected the answer would complicate things further. The one who helped you? Her name is Grace, Margaret said. She found me on the street 20 minutes after Vanessa had me removed from that parking lot. She fed me. She gave me her own bed while she slept on a mat. She never once asked who I was or what I could offer her in return. You want me to meet her? I want you to understand, Margaret said carefully. That character reveals itself most clearly in exactly the moments neither woman knew they were being observed. I'm not telling you to abandon Vanessa immediately, James. I'm telling you what I witnessed, and asking you to consider it seriously before you build a marriage on an impression that might only be half the truth. James was quiet for a long moment, turning something over in his mind before he finally spoke. Then let me test it myself, properly. Not through a disguise, but through something Vanessa would actually have to respond to honestly. What are you thinking? Tell her I've lost everything, James said slowly, the idea forming even as he spoke it aloud. The company, the money, all of it. Let's see whether Vanessa stays for the man she claims to love, or leaves the moment the fortune disappears. Margaret studied her son carefully, recognizing with a complicated mixture of pride and concern exactly how much of her own instinct for testing people's true character he'd apparently inherited. That's a considerable risk, James. If you're wrong about her, if she genuinely loves you regardless of the money, you'll have hurt someone who never deserved the suspicion. And if I'm right, James said quietly, I'll have avoided marrying someone who loves my bank account more than she loves me. I'd rather know for certain, Mum, even if the test costs me something either way. The plan, once decided, moved quickly. James staged a carefully constructed crisis. A fabricated story about a catastrophic business failure, fraudulent board decisions he claimed to have only recently discovered, assets frozen pending investigation, the Whitfield family estate itself, supposedly at risk of seizure. He delivered the news to Vanessa personally, watching her reaction with an attentiveness he'd never previously needed to apply to their relationship. Everything's gone, Vanessa, he said, sitting across from her in a modest restaurant considerably less luxurious than their usual haunts, deliberately chosen to reinforce the fabricated downturn. The company, the properties, even my mother's personal accounts have been frozen pending the investigation. I don't know what's left, honestly, beyond whatever savings I had before all this. Vanessa's expression, James noted carefully, shifted through several stages in quick succession. Shock first, seemingly genuine, followed by something harder to read, a calculating stillness that lasted just slightly too long before she finally responded. James, that's terrible. I'm so sorry. She reached for his hand, though James noticed with a small private ache that her grip felt considerably less certain than it had during any of their previous 5 months together. What happens now? I don't know, James admitted, playing the part fully. I might need to move into something considerably smaller, start over, in some sense, from close to nothing. Vanessa was quiet for a long moment, her hand still resting on his, though her eyes had drifted briefly toward the restaurant's exit, as though some part of her was already calculating an escape route she hadn't yet consciously acknowledged wanting. We'll figure it out together, she said finally, though the words carried a hollowness James recognized immediately. The same practiced performance his mother had described from the parking lot, warmth extended carefully, conditionally, for an audience that still, in this moment, expected something in return. Grace, meanwhile, learned nothing of the elaborate test unfolding around a fortune she had no idea existed. James, at his mother's suggestion, had begun visiting Grace's neighborhood under a modest pretense. Volunteering, alongside Margaret, at a small community center Grace helped run in her limited free time, using an assumed, considerably less recognizable name. "You're new," Grace observed, the first time they properly spoke, watching him awkwardly attempt to organize donated clothing into size categories. Most volunteers don't stay past their first week once they realize how much actual work it is. "I'm trying to learn something," James said honestly, which was, in its own careful way, entirely true. About what people are actually like, underneath everything they show the world. Grace studied him with the same open, unguarded curiosity she'd once shown a stranger on the street. "That's a strange thing to be trying to learn at a clothing donation table." "Maybe," James said, "or maybe it's exactly the right place." He had no idea yet exactly how quickly his careful, deliberate test of Vanessa was about to reach its breaking point, or exactly how much more complicated his own feelings toward Grace were about to become, entirely outside the boundaries of anything he'd originally planned to test at all. Vanessa's departure, when it finally came, took 3 weeks to fully unfold. Not a single dramatic exit, but a slow, steady withdrawal that revealed itself in increments. James found himself documenting almost clinically the way his mother might review a business partner's gradually shifting loyalties. The calls became less frequent first. Then the excuses for missed dinners grew thinner, less carefully constructed, as though Vanessa had stopped bothering to disguise her diminishing interest with the same effort she'd once applied to charming his family. By the second week, she'd stopped asking how he was managing at all. The earlier performance of concerned solidarity quietly abandoned once it became clear there was no fortune left to make the performance worthwhile. "I think," Vanessa said finally, in a conversation that took place, fittingly, in the same modest restaurant where James had first delivered the fabricated news, "that we might be moving too fast given everything that's happened. Maybe we both need space to figure out what we actually want." "What do you actually want, Vanessa?" James asked, watching her carefully, genuinely curious now, rather than simply testing. She hesitated, something almost like shame flickering behind her eyes before she visibly suppressed it. "I want stability, James. I've worked hard to build the life I have. I can't build a future with someone who might not be able to provide the kind of security I've always wanted." "So this was never about me specifically," James said quietly. "It was about what I could offer." "That's not fair," Vanessa said, though her voice lacked the conviction to properly defend the accusation. "Everyone considers security when they're building a life with someone." "Everyone considers it," James agreed. "Not everyone leaves the moment it disappears." Vanessa left the restaurant without another word, and James sat alone for a long time afterward, feeling considerably less triumphant about being proven right than he'd expected to feel. He told Grace the truth 3 days later, not through a staged reveal, but simply, honestly, sitting across from her at the same community center table where they'd first properly spoken. "I need to tell you something," he said. "My name isn't quite what I told you. I'm James Whitfield. My family owns Whitfield Industries. I've been coming here under an assumed name because my mother and I were testing something. Testing someone else, actually, not you. But somewhere in the process, I stopped thinking about the test entirely and started genuinely looking forward to seeing you." Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the same careful, unhurried attention she brought to everything. "The old woman, the beggar my neighbor mentioned seeing near the mall a few weeks back, the one everyone said disappeared as suddenly as she'd appeared. That was your mother. Yes, and she was testing my character. Without my knowledge. Yes," James admitted again. "I know how that sounds. I know it probably feels like exactly the kind of deception that should make you furious at both of us." Grace considered this seriously, weighing something behind her steady expression before finally speaking. "I'm not furious," she said. "I helped a stranger because she needed help, not because I expected anything from it. Finding out afterward that the stranger happened to be wealthy doesn't change why I helped her in the first place. It would only bother me if I'd have acted differently, knowing who she was. I wouldn't have." "I believe you," James said. "That's exactly the point, Grace. That's exactly what my mother saw in you, and exactly what I've come to see too over these past few weeks." Margaret, informed of both conversations within the same week, found herself experiencing an emotion she rarely allowed herself in business or in life. Genuine, uncomplicated relief. "I owe you an apology, in some sense," she told Grace, meeting her formally for the first time since the disguise had come off. No longer a beggar on the street, but the polished, immaculately presented founder of Whitfield Industries. "I tested your character without your consent, and my son compounded that deception with one of his own. Neither of us handled this with the honesty you deserved." "You're apologizing," Grace observed, studying the older woman with the same open curiosity she'd once shown a stranger against a wall, "for testing whether I was kind. That seems like an unusual thing to apologize for." "I'm apologizing for the deception," Margaret clarified, "not for wanting to know the truth. Those are different things, and I think you already understand the difference better than most people I've tested over the years." Grace smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Margaret had seen from her since the introductions began. "I think I'd have helped you either way, Mrs. Whitfield. Beggar or billionaire. That's just who I try to be." "I know," Margaret said quietly. "That's precisely why my son can't seem to stop thinking about you." Vanessa, meanwhile, learned the full truth roughly a month later. Not through James directly, but through the wider Lagos business community, where news traveled quickly once James's engagement to a woman named Grace, previously unknown to Lagos society, began circulating through social pages that had once briefly covered his engagement to Vanessa herself. She showed up at the Whitfield estate uninvited, visibly shaken, demanding an explanation. James felt no particular obligation to provide in detail. "You lied to me," she said, "about losing everything. It was never real." "No," James agreed, "it wasn't. But your reaction to it was. So this whole time, I was just a test." "You were exactly who you chose to be," James said, "when you believed there was nothing left in it for you." "I'm sorry that hurts to hear, Vanessa. But I'm not sorry I found out before the wedding, rather than after it." The wedding took place 8 months later, at a modest venue. James chose deliberately over the grand ballroom his mother's assistant had initially suggested, a decision Grace hadn't asked for, but one that James understood, by then, reflected exactly the kind of life she'd want to build, regardless of how much money now surrounded her. "You don't have to keep things small on my account," Grace told him, reviewing the guest list together a week before the ceremony. "I know what kind of family I'm marrying into now. I'm not afraid of the size of it." "I know," James said. "I'm not doing it for your comfort. I'm doing it because the version of this family I actually want to build starts with remembering exactly how we found each other. That doesn't happen in a ballroom full of people neither of us will remember by the end of the night." Margaret, watching the modest preparations unfold from her usual chair near the window, found herself thinking often of her own difficult years. The small flat, the hungry months, the particular clarity poverty had once taught her about which people's kindness could be trusted and which couldn't. She'd spent 5 decades building an empire specifically so James would never need that lesson firsthand. She hadn't expected in the end that he'd need to learn a version of it anyway. Not through hardship, but through a carefully staged test that had cost him nothing real, and had cost Vanessa everything she'd never realized she was risking. Grace continued running the community center after the wedding, though continued, undersold considerably how much the work expanded once Whitfield Industries quietly began funding it properly. New facilities, expanded donation programs, a small staff to share the workload Grace had once carried almost entirely alone. "You could have just given me money and let me stop working there myself," Grace told James the day the center's expansion was formally announced. Most wealthy husbands would prefer their wives not spend their days sorting donated clothing. I don't want you to stop, James said. I want you to have the resources to do more of it, with less exhaustion attached. There's a difference between taking the work away from you and making the work sustainable. Grace considered this, something soft and grateful crossing her expression. That's a very specific kind of listening, James. Most people hear I like my work and assume it means I'd like you to fund a hobby. I've had a lot of practice lately, James said, learning the difference between what people say and what they actually mean by it. Vanessa, in the months following the broken engagement, found her own path considerably harder than she'd anticipated. The story of her cruelty toward an old beggar woman, who'd turned out to be Margaret Whitfield, had circulated widely enough through Lagos social circles that several of her own professional relationships grew noticeably cooler. Colleagues and acquaintances alike quietly reassessing a character they'd previously taken at face value. She reached out to Margaret once, nearly a year later, not to apologize precisely, but to ask, with genuine confusion, how the older woman had known to test her in the first place. I didn't know, Margaret told her honestly, on the single occasion she agreed to the conversation. I suspected. There's a difference. I've spent 50 years learning that people who perform kindness beautifully for an audience often have very little of it left over for moments they believe don't matter. I simply needed to see which version of you was real before my son built a marriage on the wrong one. And if I'd stayed? Vanessa asked. If I'd passed the test? Then I'd have apologized for doubting you and welcomed you properly into this family, Margaret said. The test was never designed to fail you, Vanessa. You designed that part yourself, the moment you decided a beggar wasn't worth your kindness, and a broken fiancé wasn't worth your loyalty.